Hi, Juno News. Alexander Brown here, back for another episode of Not Sorry. I'm your host. I'm the director of the National Citizens Coalition, writer, communicator, campaigner. Always thrilled to be here. And while you are here, we're coming out of Black Friday. I want you to take advantage of our promo code at junonews.com/not sorry for 20% off. Now, how did Canada get its residential school story so wrong? We all remember that summer of moral panic. I certainly remember a moment of what could have been thoughtful reflection turned into something fiery but mostly peaceful, to borrow from a similar summer of social discontent that gripped our neighbors to the south. In the sequel to the bestseller Grave Error, published by True North in 2023, the follow up, Dead Wrong, from CP Champion and Tom Flanagan, and with a foreword from Candice Malcolm, is now a number one bestseller because the struggle remains for accurate information. Very few of those who spread unsubstantiated rumors about discoveries of mass unmarked graves at Kamloops and other Indian residential schools, of genocide, have admitted their errors. Dead Wrong, published by True North and Dorchester Books, paints a different picture of the Kamloops narrative. That includes the shocking unwillingness of the New York Times to retract its headline about mass graves at Kamloops, the attempt of the city council, Quesnel, to drive the mayor from office because his wife gave away 10 copies of Grave Error, the firing of high school teacher Jim McMurtry because he told the truth to students that most students who died at residential schools succumbed to TB and other illnesses of the time, the so-called documentary Sugarcane, which was nominated for an Oscar, even though it was riddled with errors about St. Joseph's Residential School at Williams Lake, BC, the attempt of the Law Society of BC to entrench the Kamloops narrative in its educational materials, even though the falsehoods were pointed out by member Jim Keller. Joining us to talk about Dead Wrong today is True North managing editor Cosmin Georgia. He contributed a chapter on the reprehensible church burnings that swept the nation at the peak of this social panic. Gerald Butts, liberal fixer, infamous Trudeau #2, ethics violator, he even called those burnings understandable at the time. They weren't then, they aren't now. Join us for this discussion. Cosmin Georgia, True North managing editor. You can find his great work here on Juno. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Dead Wrong, already a bestseller. The sequel to Grave Error. Cosmin, in your chapter, it's great that you're involved. You detail the wave of church arsons that began shortly after the Kamloops announcement, incidents that targeted Christian places of worship across denominations and regions. What do you believe were the key factors that escalated these attacks so rapidly, and how does this reflect the broader mishandling of the residential school narrative?
Yeah, first, I'd like to encourage listeners to pick up a copy of the book. I think it's a really important study of what's happened, and it's a good sequel to Grave Error. And if you haven't read that as well, I would encourage you to pick up both for this Christmas season. But absolutely, I think with regard to the church burnings, what I tried to lay out in my chapter is to tease out how the connection between the actual announcement that the Kamloops First Nation made with regard to the historical Kamloops residential school directly influenced these church burnings. Because we saw in the summer of 2021 uh, a wave of these church burnings targeting churches specifically in BC. It
Yeah.
started in the West, and that's how I begin the chapter. These churches started to go up in flames, arson incidents, even on First Nations land, burning churches that have stood for generations, attended by First Nations people, by Indigenous people, where their children were baptized, where they had weddings, where they held funerals. And it's really tragic because the legacy media and the political establishment has chosen to ignore this connection. They have spent years treating these incidents as isolated, completely unconnected. And when you look at the trend of what's happening, the lack of arrests, and even the stated influence of some of these arson incidents and vandalism incidents specifically, when you see churches painted with red paint and letters, specifically calling out the church itself for its involvement in residential schools, the connection is obvious.
Yeah, and there were even churches destroyed despite having no direct ties to residential schools. Like they were on the First Nations land. I'm up the street from St. Augustine's, not on First Nations land, but that was defaced, and that church was built in like 1990. It's like, what the heck are we doing here? And so, what how does that underscore sort of the dangers of unchecked misinformation here? Like, what lessons should Canada learn to prevent such collateral damage in the future?
Yeah, and it gets to the root of this because it's a disturbing anti-Christian sentiment. When you look at the churches targeted the arsonists were indiscriminate in the churches they chose. Like you mentioned, churches built before the residential schooling system, but also denominations which had nothing to do with residential schools. You see
Yeah.
Baptist churches targeted, even Eastern Orthodox churches, Ukrainian Catholic churches. These are churches that weren't even involved in the residential schooling system, and they're simply targeted because they have a cross, because they openly present as places of Christian places of worship. And it's troubling to see when lawmakers, when influencers, and when even First Nations openly encourage, if not implicitly, uh, don't discourage the attacking of Christian institutions as a sort of reparation for the harms caused by residential schools. And look, this book does not ignore the historically documented harms caused by residential schools, but it does really question some of the narrative spun. And I think it does a great job at debunking the attack on Christianity as a religion, but also on Western civilization itself.
No, and I think that's an important thing to note as well, which is I think just as a reader who's looking forward to going through, I've read your excerpt. I want to go through the whole thing. It's no one is closed off from a perspective of caring in regards to that there were some wrongs here, that there was an imperfect system, that we cannot do better in a kind of reconciliation. It's the social contagion aspect. It's the whoa, what the heck happened here? It is disinformation that stems from, say, the New York Times, and then watching this just take off. Cosmin, in the MacDonald Laurier Institute study, which you reference, it obviously shows that doubling of arson at religious institutions, very few charges laid. From your perspective, why has there been such a lack of coordinated investigation by the RCMP? What does this say about priorities and protecting religious freedoms?
Right. And there's a few reasons behind that. I think it's a complicated issue, but primarily there's no political interest. And as much as the government likes to pretend that there's an arm's length distance between the government and the RCMP,
Yeah.
the government does have a lot of say in what gets prosecuted, what sort of charges get pursued. And there has been zero national inquiry into these arsons that have spanned from coast to coast. Like, this is a nationwide crisis. And every attempt to bring this up in the House of Commons, to issue a condemnation, but even to press both public safety and intelligence officials, the people leading the country, national security, etc., in those areas, seem disinterested, or at least don't have the incentive politically to pursue this. And it's unfathomable, right? Because
Yeah.
we're talking about a lot of Canadians are Christians. The Christian heritage of this country is undeniable. And here we are completely ignoring this. Our politicians would rather downplay it, if not even excuse some of the actions. We saw our former prime minister say that these church burnings were somehow understandable.
Yeah.
So it's simply outrageous. The RCMP has not established a task force, as far as I know, to target and truly find out what's going on, whether any of this is a organized effort or if any of these incidents are committed by the same perpetrators. A lot of arson incidents, unfortunately, the suspects do get away because of the nature of the crimes. They don't get prosecuted, and we just need, as a country, to really reckon with the fact that we've let this go on for how many years now, and still the number of arrests are laughable.
Yeah. And there's also a media reluctance piece there too, right? Like connect these arsons as a pattern with outlets like CBC delaying acknowledgement for years. How has this selective reporting contributed to the perpetuation of the flawed narrative? Like, what reforms would you advocate for in Canadian journalism to address this?
Yeah, so well, you would have to completely uproot the legacy media to some degree because they are so selective in their coverage. I mean, just look at the coverage, non-existent coverage of our book. We're talking about, well, just going back to Grave Error, we're talking about a national bestseller, and I'm
Yeah,
not sure if I'm allowed to give the sales numbers, but the sales numbers compete with some of the best-selling books in this country, and there has been a total media freeze on the coverage of this. And anytime it's mentioned,
yeah,
it's through these so-called experts who are completely one-sided and will trash the book without even reading it. Most of the commentaries I've seen in the legacy media are completely ignorant of the actual contents of this book. They simply comment on it without knowing anything about it. So selective reporting, absolutely. And they just simply do not want to have this discussion, because if they approach this conversation about what was claimed a few years ago in 2021 about what actually was discovered at the Kamloops, which now they've quietly admitted to be soil disturbances and anomalies, and the fact that there hasn't been any remains excavated or discovered at these institutions that indicate uh, genocide, but also like mass burials of children. When they discuss the facts, they know that their argument crumbles apart, so they don't want to have this conversation, and that's why they're ignoring our book. And I fully expect they're going to do the same thing with Dead Wrong, because it has a detailed breakdown of the church fires, of the arsons, and the response to it, and the lack of consideration for Canadian culture, history, these historical buildings, but also a religion in this country.
yeah. And I'm sure one of those voices in critique would be an academic like Sean Carlton, who would dismiss these concerns as I know that you've called, his efforts distraction tactics. Your excerpt even mentions that there were tragic deaths that were included in these church arsons in Winnipeg at the Covenant International Church, leading to murder charges. How does this incident exemplify, that there is a real human cost here to the residential school story being dead wrong? Like, what support do you think these affected communities deserve? How do they get just ignored in all of this?
Yeah, you're right. So in Winnipeg, there was a fire at a church, and from my understanding, it was in a building. So the main floor of this building was used as a church, but there was also uh, people attending this church who lived above it, and there, from my understanding, there were also immigrants, new immigrants to Canada, who were renting that space, and they unfortunately died as a result of this church fire. Now, an individual was arrested. He was an Indigenous man. There's no reporting on the motives of this individual. We haven't seen anything come out of trial about this individual's motives. But this is a church that was targeted, lit on flames, and two people tragically passed away as a result of this. I mean, where are we as a country when we're not looking at this after 3 to 4 years of churches being lit on flames and two people die, and this isn't headline news across the country? It's outrageous. And Sean Carlton would like to say we're making a mountain out of a molehill, but here there are two individuals who lost their lives because of a church fire. That is the facts.
Yeah, and a church fire downstream of social contagion, of moral panic, our
Yeah.
version of a fiery but mostly peaceful summer, quite literally, like the America had theirs, we had ours. There are 110 incidents at my last check, tracked by that True North map that you've done such good work on, including both arson and vandalism. And your chapter paints a picture of widespread anti-Christian sentiment. If you're a faith-based community heading into the holidays, how can you safeguard your place of worship while also fostering reconciliation? Is there a balance that can be struck there?
Yeah, it's tough to say, because on one hand we could have increased police presence monitoring these churches, but there's only so much people can do, right? Church communities are reliant on the donations of their own congregations, and I'm sure there's many that have chosen to just get personal private security for their institutions, for their places of worship. And it's such a sad state of where we are, that communities are left to fend for themselves, essentially, because the government, even policing, chooses to protect certain groups over others because of political inconvenience.
Now, finally, as someone who has delved deeply into this topic, what inspired you to contribute to Dead Wrong? And how do you hope your chapter will encourage Canadians to reevaluate the residential school narrative for the sake of truth and justice?
Yeah, I think what inspired me was what originally motivated me to make the map. And that was that I was looking at the media reporting. I was observing that there was a giant black hole covering these incidents as connected, as a nationwide crisis. And to put it all on a map, for me, was the best way I personally could make sense of it. But I think also other people could use as a resource and truly see how widespread this actually is, because it's hard to argue with data. And when you look at a map and see all of these incidents laid out exactly where they happened, you notice it's hard to deny when you see an entire map of the country lit up with red pins. And that is the truth staring at you hard in the face. And you can argue with it, against it, and their chosen tactic is to get people to not look at these incidents as connected, but it's right there for everybody to access. And I think that's what motivated me. I wanted to tell this story and to get it to people, because unfortunately the media has done such a shoddy job of it, that I think it requires independent journalists like us to go out there and do their job for them.
Yeah, independent journalists, independent minded readers. Cosmin, where can folks find the book before the holidays?
Yeah, you could pick up a copy on Amazon, as well as just visit Juno News. You could find an ad on it on our website, and there's several articles, and I'm sure there will be a link in the video description as well, hopefully.
Awesome. Cosmin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alex.